What can I say about our guest speaker? What can I say about Professor David Celermajer? He's well known to many people in this room. He's the clinical director at HRI. He's a professor and heart specialist at RPA. And he's a doctor 3 times over. As well as his medical qualifications, he has a master's from Oxford, a PhD in children's heart disease from London University, and a PhD in science from this very university. He was also world debating champion and the public speaking champion in the 1980s, where I'm reliably informed his topic that he won was why we shouldn't play leapfrog with unicorns. So please welcome Professor David Celermajer.
Thank you so much, Sophie, and good evening, Minister, Excellency, colleagues and friends. This time last week, I was doing something almost as interesting as this. I was at the Australian premiere of a movie called Beyond the Flood. Beyond the Flood is Leonardo Dicaprio's documentary about climate change, revisiting Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. And it was a terrific documentary. I'd commend it to you, but it was very long on pulling on the emotional heartstrings about the dangers of climate change and very short on solutions. And the best solutions that Dicaprio had were really, in my view, unworkable. His message was that we all as individuals have to change if we want to conquer climate change. But how can you stop the kids eating Doritos that are cooked in the palm oil that have made the Indonesians burn down the rainforests to plant the palm oil plantations? Kids won't stop eating Doritos. How do you stop Texans, Professor Cook, driving SUVs? You can't, I'm reliably informed, you can't stop a Texan driving an SUV. If we wait for individual change, it's not going to happen. If we wait for governments to get together, it took them 22 years to get to a rather anemic agreement in Paris earlier in the year. I don't want to say that's not a good step, it's a great step. But the answer is not in individuals, it's not in governments. The answer is in science. Science is our only hope to save the planet. Whether it be, I'm sure you all know that trees have chlorophyll, and chlorophyll, if you shine sunlight on it, it makes carbon dioxide into oxygen. So there'll be huge vats of algae and chlorophyll-containing plants in the outback converting carbon dioxide to oxygen. Or there'll be nuclear fusion plants. I don't know how many of you have heard of nuclear fusion. Completely clean energy. You just collide 2 hydrogens together and it makes a helium if you collide them hard enough. And for those of you who never understood what E equals mc squared means, when the 2 hydrogens collide, as they do in the sun 600 million times a day, they form a helium molecule, and the helium molecule is just a little bit lighter than the 2 hydrogens were. And that tiny little bit of mass creates an incalculable amount of energy, except Einstein calculated the energy is the mass times the speed of light squared, so that's what equals mc. But nuclear fusion, well, that's a hope. But whatever the hope is, it's science. Now, on the same day as I saw Beyond the Flood, the Australian Bureau of Statistics released a very interesting and important statistic, and that is that our life expectancy as Australians increased by 4 years in the previous 15 years. So the average male life expectancy now, 81.5 years, average female, 85. And superficially, that sounds fantastic. But at a little deeper level, those 4 years are really only good for us if they're lived in health rather than in frailty. And again, if you wait for individuals to do that, or if you wait for governments to work out how to do that, it's not going to happen, unfortunately. It's only going to happen through science. And it gives me the opportunity to talk about, we've celebrated the young researchers. There are a couple of not so young researchers who are making extraordinary advances at the Heart Research Institute about healthy aging. You might have heard of a condition that's very common in the elderly called aortic valve narrowing, one of the valves that lets blood out of the heart. Doesn't open, instead of opening like that, it opens like that as it cakes up with age. And that makes people very breathless and have a very poor quality of life. Well, Professor Martin Ng, one of the group leaders at the Heart Research Institute, is one of the pioneers internationally of developing devices that you can put in through a catheter and avoid open heart surgery in people who are too old and frail to cope with that. And so Martin is at the forefront of research as to how to fix that problem in an acceptable way to allow healthy aging. Our illustrious director, Sean Jackson, is working on a drug that has extraordinary hope for preventing or treating stroke. We've heard a lot tonight about blood clots and thrombosis. The trick with thrombosis is trying to dissolve the clot without causing bleeding elsewhere. So it's all well and good if someone's got a stroke because of a clot, you give them a clot-busting drug, but if they have a bleed elsewhere, you've done them no good at all. And Sean and his group are at the forefront of working out how to solve that dilemma of treating strokes when it happens. But as importantly, Ben Friedman, the Deputy Director of the Heart Research Institute, another not-so-young investigator, very worth celebrating, Ben has discovered that if you take people who are over 65 and you put their thumbs on a smartphone, that 3% of them in a 2-week period are actually in an irregular heart rhythm called atrial fibrillation, which is a powerful risk factor for stroke. So Ben is promoting worldwide now this smartphone application that everyone over 65 can have done. 3% of them will find that they're at high risk of stroke and go on a medication to prevent it. Another example of healthy aging. My group's fortunate enough to have developed a device that we really feel, and we've got great preliminary data, might improve the quality and quantity of life in people with heart failure by putting a little device in the heart that blows off the extra pressure when the pressure gets too high. So there are 4 groups at the Heart Research Institute who have turned their mind to the problem of healthy aging, and whether it be healthy aging or heart disease in the young, the point I'm trying to make is that the great challenges of our age won't be conquered by individual behaviour. They'll be helped by government initiatives, and I don't want to lessen the importance, but if anything's going to save us, it's science. So we've got this extraordinary paradox in Australia at the moment, that at just the time we need to be thinking about, learning about, speaking about, supporting and funding science, actually it is the time in the last 30 years with the least funding and the least enthusiasm for science in our recent history. So, for example, I don't know how many of you know, but if you ask high school children in 2015 what proportion of them have science or maths as their favourite subject, it's 11%. 25 years ago, it was 30%. I have no idea why science and maths have become less sexy, if you like, less important, but fewer children are electing to do it at secondary level, and thus fewer children are electing to do it at tertiary level. And it's not just the attitudes to science that have changed, it's the funding paradigms. So, for example, at the National Health and Medical Research Council, of all the grants put in by great scientists around Australia for money to fund great research ideas, the funding success rate this year was 12%. Which means that 88% didn't get funded and have to wait another year for a 12% chance to get funded. So there's an enormous amount of great science that isn't getting funded. And it's not just medical research. Sadly, I just couldn't believe this, but you probably have heard that the CSIRO's climate change division was completely disbanded earlier this year. Federal government funding was withdrawn. Now, I have no pretensions to understanding the difficulties of making fundamental government decisions about funding, and I know that there are a lot of priorities, so I don't mean to be critical. I just mean to say that at a time when we need science more than ever, it's being funded less than ever. And that gap has to be made up somehow. And there are 2 ways to make it up. One is innovative ways of drawing in industry and commercial partners, and the other way is philanthropy. And I don't want to be heavy-handed about this, but I do want everyone here to think about the importance of science to our children and our children's children in very tangible ways, and realise that if you've got money, you know, there are tons of valuable causes, but science is where it's at. So if you believe in the importance of funding science, why the Heart Research Institute? And what I'd like to share with you in a few minutes is just to commend to you why you could regard the Heart Research Institute as a great partner in science for heart health. And to do that, I want to go back to the vision of the founding fathers of the Heart Research Institute in 1989. My predecessor as Scanditt Professor of Cardiology at this university, David Kelly, David Richmond, a wonderful cardiologist at Prince Alfred Hospital, and Phil Harris, who's here tonight, got together and said, we want to set up a research institute with two clear purposes. The first is they wanted people to get together in a collaborative way and solve the problem of atherosclerosis, or cholesterol plaques in the arteries, which is the proximate cause of heart attack and stroke. And this is a mystifying disease. 2 weeks ago, I saw a 40-year-old who is, I don't want to identify him, but he's been the world champion twice in an arduous endurance sport. And not only did he have a heart attack kayaking off Manly Beach, from which he's made an excellent recovery, but on his angiogram, he has a lot of cholesterol plaques. But his cholesterol level is normal, he's never smoked, he's exercised heavily, and it behoves us still in 2016 to understand why about 40% of people who have heart attacks have no risk factors for it. And so that vision of Phil Harris, David Kelly, and David Richmond still stands tall. And the second part of that vision was to breed and train a generation of clinicians and scientists who would understand the problems of people and take it to the basic science lab to work with people like Sean Jackson and like Ben Kyle and try and solve problems which could then be taken back to the patients. And if you look, it's only been 25 years, but I want to share with you that if you look at the vision and the mission of those three gentlemen, it's actually worked extraordinarily well. And I just want to share a couple of stories with you of highlights from the canon of work of the HRI. About 2 Friday nights ago, I was called at around this time because one of my very precious patients, a 55-year-old woman with an important heart disease, had developed a terrible infection in her abdomen. And when she came in, her blood pressure was unrecordably low. And I think if she'd have left it another hour, she wouldn't be with us, and she is still with us. And she had a condition called septic shock. That's when the infection is so overwhelming that all the blood vessels in the body dilate up and the blood pressure goes through the boots, and it's got a 30% mortality rate. Well, one of the extraordinary basic scientists who spent a decade at the Heart Research Institute, Roland Stocker, who now works at the Victor Chang Cardiac Research Institute, discovered with a group of clinicians the enzymatic pathway that results in septic shock. And what that opens the path, it's a tremendous basic science discovery that was published in Nature Medicine. And now what Roland and his group are working on are a way of inhibiting that pathway, because this lady of mine, this 55-year-old lady, we poured noradrenaline into her and adrenaline, and nothing would bring her blood pressure up because her blood vessels they wouldn't listen to reason. They were stuck open. And Roland's pathway, the cis-Wu pathway, the kynurenine pathway, gives us real hope for being able to treat that. A disease that sounds like a 13th century disease, plague, septic shock, and we still haven't conquered it. But Roland's discoveries are, in my opinion, the best way internationally to try and solve this problem. Another extraordinary breakthrough was made by Kerry Rye, who was at the Heart Research Institute for over a decade. You heard earlier tonight a little bit about something called the good cholesterol, which people have researched for atherosclerosis for the last decade or so. Well, what Kerry has discovered is this good cholesterol not only helps in atherosclerosis, but it prevents diabetes and it cures arthritis. Now, that's in an animal model, but she's worked out the molecular pathways by which that happens, and so it's one of those magnificent pieces of serendipity where something you're doing to cure a heart problem might actually end up curing another problem because you've got the breadth of vision to work out how things might work outside your small box of scientific interest. The third thing I want to share with you briefly is a discovery that I was privileged to be involved with, and that was that passive smoking damages the heart and blood vessels of teenagers. And we did this by taking a group of kids who smoked, kids who grew up in a house where both parents smoked, and kids who had never been exposed to smoke, and we showed frightening changes in the blood vessels and hearts of these children. Now that piece of research, that small piece of research on 80 teenagers, with a piece of research also done in Australia on asthma, was taken up by a congressman in California who went to Congress in California and got public places to ban outdoor smoking, which then dominoed across the extra 49 states and all across Europe and Australia. And that small piece of research that started at the HRI has now been credited with already saving several tens of millions of lives worldwide from decreasing in exposure to passive smoking. And the final piece of research I wanted to share with you is my 40-year-old with lots of atherosclerosis who's exercised all his life and is incredibly healthy. Well, I'm sending him to see another group leader at the Heart Research Institute, Sanjay Patel, who's also here tonight, because Sanjay has discovered that an old medication for gout, something called colchicine, an old drug, well, you can teach the old drug new tricks. It turns out that colchicine is a very powerful way of suppressing inflammation in the coronary arteries and almost certainly reducing the risk of recurrent heart attacks in young people who have strokes and heart attacks. So that's a flavour for how the mission and vision of Phil Harris and his colleagues has been fulfilled in terms of scientific discovery. What about training the next generation? Well, you saw Claire Hawkins, recruited by the School of Biomedical Sciences in Copenhagen. The wonderful Chris Bursell, I'll cry if I talk about Chris leaving to go to SAMRI. Chris has been recruited after an illustrious several years at the Heart Research Institute to the New South Australian Health and Medical Research Institute because she's so well trained and so well regarded nationally that a young institute want to drag her away from us. Roger Dean, the foundation director of the Heart Research Institute, went on to become the Chancellor of Canberra University. Philip Barter, the next director after Roger Dean, discovered the protein that transfers cholesterol between the good and the bad cholesterol, and inhibiting that enzyme has enormous hope for saving tens of thousands of lives worldwide. So I think the second part of the vision of training generations of clinicians and scientists, Mark Adams, the head of my department at cardiology at Royal Prince Alfred, did his PhD at the HRI. Martin Ning and Sanjay Patel, who I've mentioned, are now independent group leaders. They did their PhDs at the HRI. So there is a virtuous cycle of mentors and their protégés, and the protégés becoming mentors, and the clinicians and the scientists talking to each other to solve real problems. Now, it is a time of change at HRI. Some senior people are leaving, and some bright young stars are coming. And that presents tremendous opportunity and an excitement about the place. And you've already heard from Sean about the extraordinary building that is the Charles Perkins Centre, where the vision was to have agricultural scientists talking to mathematicians, talking to robotic engineers, talking to clinicians, talking to diabetologists, talking to exercise physiologists in the corridor to really solve problems like food sustainability, non-obesogenic wheats, how you design roads so people who are tired don't fall asleep at the wheel. These extraordinary multidisciplinary problems that can only be solved in a multidisciplinary environment. So it is an exciting time at the HRI, and I commend it to you. So I started off this evening talking to you about Before the Flood. And the reason Dicaprio called his movie Before the Flood is because when he was a baby, his father, who was an animator, hung a painting, a poster of a painting above his bed that the young Leonardo was fascinated by. And it was a painting many of you will know. It was The Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch. It has 3 panels. The original is in the Prado, as many of you will know. The first panel is Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden being created by the Lord. And it's a very simple panel and it's a simple time. But in those times, everyone lived till there was about 40. Or Abel was even younger when he was knocked off by his brother. So people didn't have a very long life expectancy. The middle panel is the exciting one. That's the one that's called Before the Flood. And that's where there's a lot of activity. There are a lot of people buzzing about. You can feel the energy from that middle panel. And that's where we're at the moment. And the third panel was this grotesque and apocalyptic vision of hell, with dark, fiery creatures eating their own young and the earth in flames. And I think that's the vision Dicaprio might have of the future unless we solve this problem through science. And so we may be living in the halcyon generation. We may be living in the generation where we live longer than our parents and we live longer than our children. I don't mean to be unusually bleak, but I'm not the only person who thinks that that is a strong possibility. So for each one of the panels of the Garden of Earthly Delights, I want to share with you one thing that I hope you'll take with you. The first commendation is for science. Please think about it. Learn about it, support it, fund it, because if in 2016 you're not going to fund science, what are you going to fund? The second panel is the HRI. The HRI has a box, which is heart disease. It's an important box because it's the #1 killer, not just in Australia, not just in the US, but absolutely worldwide, with increasing westernisation in China, India, sub-Saharan Africa. It's the #1 killer worldwide. And the third thing I want to commend to you for the final panel is philanthropy. I think it's really important, and I'm not going to tell you about the pledge cards Sophie has already, but I think if we want the message of hope and we want to survive after the flood, it's a partnership between science, innovation, and philanthropy. Thank you very much.